Hello and welcome to a fresh episode of Global Tantrum. As always, I am your host, Steve Halley. With me is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson of Williams College. Galen, how are you doing? You're looking better than you were a few days ago, my friend.
Yeah, don't get the flu. It's
Yeah,
terrible.
it's not good, but you're back in the saddle here.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been contagious for a while, but it takes a while to recover one's energy levels, it turns out. It's just like knocks you right out. So stay away from that stuff.
Absolutely. Get your flu shots. Yeah, even if you're adherent of Make America Healthy Again, flu shots are recommended.
Hey,
And
I got a flu shot, and I'll just say if I hadn't, it might and probably would have been a lot worse.
a
So,
lot worse. Yeah. So that's good. I don't think you're going to infect me over Zoom, most
yeah,
likely.
let's hope.
Yeah, it's not that virulent. Anyway, this week we spent a couple episodes on tariffs, and we're not going to go back down that road for now. Thanks
For
to
now.
our friend Professor Ryan Weldzius for all that great knowledge he dropped on us. Instead, we're going to go over to East Asia and check up on the Taiwan Strait, right, Galen?
We sure are. And depending on who you ask and what year it is, I think by any objective measures, got to be in the top five most dangerous places on the planet and is making a run at being number one.
Yeah, I would say it's top one
Okay. Fair
in
enough,
terms
man.
of like the magnitude of what would happen if it actually kicks off. Others would say Ukraine. Fair enough. A lot of people are still dying there. Others would say Gaza. Fair enough. Same deal. But in terms of international ramifications, it's probably Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. I remember when I was getting my master's now almost 20 years ago at the University of Chicago in
Is
security
that right?
studies.
Oh,
Yeah,
man.
numerous professors there were like, what's the most dangerous place in the entire world? And we were like, oh, Iraq, Afghanistan, yada. We were in the middle of the global war on terror. And they're like, no, it's the Taiwan Strait. It's like, if it's going to go down, and this was 20 years ago before China was a military superpower the way it is now.
Yeah.
So,
So what's been going on that has brought this to our attention in recent days?
yeah. So the People's Liberation Army Navy, which is kind of a funny construct, but just the Chinese Navy, the Chinese Army, the Chinese rocket
The
forces.
P-Lan, that's what
Yeah,
we'll call it.
those guys have encircled Taiwan. They do this occasionally. They've done it again in a series of military exercises that, you know, again, they do this every so often. It just gets more and more serious and they demonstrate more and more capability every time they do it. So basically, they have encircled the entire island of Taiwan with, I think, 5 or 6 different groups of ships. They've sent out one of their main aircraft carriers in what appears to be a carrier strike group. So not just the carrier, but also the support ships, the aircraft, the whole 9 yards. And it appears that they are rehearsing a blockade of the island. They've also been rehearsing amphibious operations, so landings, things like that. They're not actually landing on Taiwan, but they've been practicing it more and more with Coast Guard groups and Marines. So what they're doing is they're basically turning the screws. And I guess there's a number of sort of proximate causes for this particular round of hostilities. One is that the new-ish president of Taiwan, he goes by William Lai. That's the anglicized name. It's Lai Ching-te, I think, is his Chinese name. Has kicked out a bunch of pro-Beijing agitators, or so he calls them. Whether or not they actually are, we don't know. But President Lai is from the Democratic People's Party, which is increasingly a pro-independence party. And he is even more pro-independence than his predecessor. And the Chinese really don't like him. And so they didn't like this action, and they have shown it by sending out a bunch of military hardware and basically demonstrating to Taiwan and the rest of the world that they can choke Taiwan off if they want to. That's not happening yet, but they're demonstrating the capability.
And that's increasingly become at least my reading of the literature, the military scenario that a lot of people consider to be very likely. And we'll talk about that more in just a bit. But one of the obvious reasons, if you've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is what the United States did in the midst of that crisis, was to put a blockade around Cuba, called it a quarantine because a
Hmm.
blockade is an act of war. So they just called it something else to try to get out of that dilemma. But if China were to do this to Taiwan, Taiwan is almost completely dependent on imports from the rest of the world
Right.
across any number of critical sectors, whether it be energy or something else. And so that would really put the ball, as we'll talk about, in the court of the United States. It would force the United States to basically make the next step that might bring about a serious round of hostilities, which again gets to Steve's point about this being the most dangerous place on earth. But
Mhm.
I think we wanted to talk a little bit about, for people who might not be familiar with some of the history, how we got to this point. So, like, Steve, how did the current government of Taiwan even come into being in the first place? So not the current
Yeah.
government, but this split between Taiwan and mainland China.
Excellent question. Well, it dates back to, I think, the late 40s and early 50s when the communists under Chairman Mao Zedong won the Chinese Civil War, which was itself sort of an extension of what happened in World War II in China. And the communists ended up winning the Civil War against the nationalists, which were led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai shek. And his party was called the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. And he and his people and his army fled to what was then called the island of Formosa, which is now called Taiwan, and established the Republic of China there. So, we have the communists on the mainland and we have the nationalists on what is now Taiwan. And the nationalists ran effectively a military dictatorship there for decades, and like not a very nice one in any way, shape, or form. It was not a democracy. In fact, it was pretty similar to South Korea at this point in time, which was also a nationalist military dictatorship arrayed against the North Koreans, the communists. Um, and of course, the Korean War was fought there. There was no equivalent between China and Taiwan because you had the Taiwan Strait in between them. And there was some shelling and so forth between the two areas, but there was no military confrontation. The communists obviously were much larger, but militarily weak at this point. They could not really go across the strait to invade, especially because the Americans wouldn't let them.
Yeah. And if you want to understand the origins of China's nuclear program, it goes back to some of these initial crises over the Taiwan Straits in the 1950s
Mm-hmm.
when the Eisenhower administration essentially blackmailed, or at least that's certainly how Chairman Mao viewed it, the PRC with US military might. And obviously, the presence of nuclear weapons played a role in that. And that was the moment at which Mao decided that China needed to get a bomb of its own. The situation today with Taiwan, by the way, is quite different. If you look at sort of traditional marks or indices of how democratic a country is, Taiwan ranks very highly on democratic scores, which is one of the parts of this debate. Things get pretty interesting in terms of US policy toward Taiwan starting in the early 1970s. I think we've talked about this before, but when Nixon and Kissinger engineered the opening to China to exploit the Sino-Soviet split, prior to 1971, I believe, the United States had actually recognized the Republic of China, or Taiwan, as rightfully holding China's permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council.
Right.
Nixon and Kissinger did away with that policy, but left some pretty serious ambiguity in what US policy toward Taiwan is. So the famous Shanghai Communique of 1972, which basically articulated Washington's one China policy, which is essentially there is only one China and Taiwan is a part of China,
Right.
without I believe the word used in the English version is acknowledging the PRC's position, not
which could mean
necessarily.
anything or nothing, right?
Correct. Not necessarily recognizing it. And this got even more ambiguous later in the decade when the Carter administration normalized relations with China fully. But as a part of that, Congress passed what's called the Taiwan Relations Act, which essentially says something to the effect that the United States is supposed to keep Taiwan well armed so that it can defend itself, without spelling out whether the United States will intervene on Taiwan's behalf in a military crisis. And so this is known as strategic ambiguity. And that policy has come under more pressure in recent years because while we still had crises over Taiwan as late as the 1990s, I think it was 1996 when we had a major Taiwan Straits crisis, it wasn't as big of a concern then because the United States was so far and ahead in terms of the military balance that it wasn't a huge problem for the Clinton administration to put U.S. forces in the area. That has started to shift in recent years as China has launched this major military buildup, which for many analysts means they now have at least in theater superiority, and some major places that conduct war games have China now winning wars over Taiwan. So
let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah.
So when they saw, especially the United States, utterly destroy the Iraqi military during the Gulf War, this is a big wake-up call to the Chinese. As long as the United States is on the side of Taiwan, even ambiguously, right? Even if there's a chance that they are, because they never spelled it out, to your point, they were not going to be able to successfully invade Taiwan. They wouldn't take the chance. They need the ability to defeat the United States in theater, and in particular, the United States Navy. So they started developing, I guess you can call it area denial technologies, in particular, land-to-sea missiles, which are cheap and abundant and can blow holes in our carrier fleets, right? And they demonstrated those capabilities.
And they got a bunch of them.
A lot. Yeah,
Yeah.
thousands and thousands of them. They also have rockets that are designed to incinerate our military bases in the area, Okinawa, Guam, and so on. They can hit all of these different bases with conventional arms and really put a dent in our ability to respond. So they've raised the stakes. And then the last piece of the puzzle is, can they actually successfully mount an invasion, an amphibious invasion? And the answer to that has been probably not for a really long time, but they've been working on that set of capabilities too. Hence the exercises that we talked about earlier in the episode.
And the potential appeal of the blockade option. I mean, even if China were to pull off a cross-channel assault and amphibious assault, anyone that studies war knows amphibious operations are the most difficult ones. And by all estimates, it would be very bloody. Now, I don't think that would deter the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, because we should mention retaking Taiwan is arguably their number one foreign policy objective.
What they say. And they have said it for a long time, especially now that Xi has been in charge for 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, however long that might take. So I'm not saying they would be deterred by the large number of casualties, but when you'll hear this term, turning Taiwan into a strategic hedgehog, basically equipping Taiwan with anti-amphibious operation military equipment, trying to raise the costs for a Chinese assault extremely high. The blockade option doesn't necessarily avoid that in the final analysis, but is maybe more attractive for that reason.
Right. Yeah. And if you're the Chinese Communist Party, if you're Chairman Xi Jinping, you kind of have two considerations here. One is you don't want to lose to the United States or the Taiwanese. Number one, like just straight up, you can't afford to lose this war. It might result in regime change or something like that, depending on, because it's a big roll of the dice. So you have to be very sure that you're not going to lose. Number one. Number two, you don't want to destroy Taiwan. as a result of winning the war, because then you don't have anything. You have an island of 23 million people, less however many people you killed, and it's just a big burden and it's not helpful to you. You would prefer to preserve Taiwan, which is a very highly developed country with a lot of important assets, in particular, one asset called TSMC, which is the world's foremost manufacturer of advanced semiconductors. And TSMC makes stuff that literally no other company or country on earth can make. It's very special semiconductors that are absolutely necessary for cutting edge AI applications, for instance. So these technologies of the future that will provide supposedly massive economic benefits and basically decide who the next global hegemon might be, right? It's a major strategic technology.
And that was done very deliberately. I think the founder of TSMC, is it Morris Chang? I'll have to double check. Okay, double check it, but I think it was established in the late 1980s. And Taiwan refers to this as its silicon shield. The idea that an invading force is not going to want to destroy those facilities, or, as we have seen other countries do in the past, have Taiwan destroy those facilities to deny them to China in the event of an invasion. So that is a card of sorts that the Taiwanese hold. By the way, it's also a card they hold vis-a-vis the United States. Now, whether U.S. policy has shifted toward Taiwan is a little unclear. President Biden famously said 4 times that the United States would come to Taiwan's aid in the event of a conflict with China, which was a departure.
A major departure.
Yes.
And 4 times means it's probably not a slip of the tongue or of the brain.
But all 4 times, other members of the administration sort of tried to walk it back, which is to say, I'm not sure anyone's totally sure. And just because President Biden said it doesn't mean a President Trump or his successor would pursue the same policy in that respect. So
what has Trump said? We've had 2 Trump administrations. What did he say in his first administration, and what's he saying now?
I think he's been pretty ambiguous.
Okay.
I'd have to look up the exact wording, but he seems less. Biden was quite explicit.
Yeah.
And every time he said it, the Taiwanese were unsurprisingly pretty happy with it. Yeah. But like, that would be an enormous decision because it could lead to World War III.
Yes. Let's talk about that a little bit later, what the contours of a conflict would look like, who would get involved in it, and drill down a little bit more on Trump. So, like, from my recollection, Trump has treated Taiwan like he's treated any other U.S. ally, which is pretty badly. He doesn't seem to have any intrinsic interest in Taiwan as a democracy, as even an ambiguous U.S. ally, so on. They rate lower than Israel. I don't think there's any question about that in his cosmology.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, unclear where to place them vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis Europe, Ukraine, so on. But, he's also, I think, adopted a tough position towards China in his second administration. He did in his first 2, but, we now have 145% tariffs.
Yes.
On China.
He has walked back, or at least delayed the other ones. Those ones have only escalated.
They've only escalated, and the Chinese have escalated in response. And so, one reason not to go to war over Taiwan was it would prompt an explosive and forceful decoupling of the 2 economies. That's now happening anyway. On the other hand, Trump seems to be interested in strong-arming the Chinese into a grand bargain of some kind, because he likes these massive negotiations that tie together lots of issues. And we know that Xi Jinping wants Taiwan by hook or by crook while he's still in office, meaning, before he dies, basically, because he's going to be in office until he dies. There's no question about that in my mind. That's a major priority for him. So maybe Trump would be willing to trade away US support for Taiwan in exchange for his policy goals vis-a-vis China. And Xi Jinping would then have to weigh the economic aspects of that, which would include probably the appreciation of Chinese currency, the redressing of the trade balance to whatever extent possible, and all the other unfair stuff that China does on the trade side of things and technology side of things, which is a lot. Abandoning
Yeah.
that, he gets Taiwan for free, more or less. Well, he'd still have to fight the Taiwanese, to be clear, and that's not nothing. Come to
It's
their aid.
not, but then it becomes a matter of when, not if, and what the smoldering ruins look like.
It might not be necessary,
Yeah.
right? It might not be necessary. The Taiwanese could then know that the US is not coming and make some kind of accommodation for, home rule, where they cut a deal, because this has been a possibility in the past. Ironically, the Kuomintang is now the pro-Chinese party or the pro-communist party. Used
Yeah,
to be
but
the
so
nationalists.
there's two things that have happened that have made that less attractive. I mean,
True.
this was the Hong Kong model, and the first thing that happened was what happened to Hong Kong.
It got
Um,
squashed like
and
a bug.
so, so the whole one country, two systems model looks a lot less attractive to Taiwanese than it
Yeah.
did prior to 2019, I think.
Hong Kongers don't even have putative independence anymore.
No. And my understanding is if you ask anyone in Taiwan about that possibility now, they'll laugh you out of the room because of
Yeah.
what they saw. And then the other piece is there used to be a lot more support for a potential reunification with the mainland at some point. And partially because political liberalization in China has not taken place, partially because it has taken place in Taiwan,
Mm.
but also largely because of generational reasons, is my understanding. Like earlier generations might have actually been initially from mainland China and had like
Mhm.
real connections to it. The younger generations don't have that same perspective. And so you've
Mhm.
seen support for a peaceful reunification option sort of plummet.
Newer generations consider themselves Taiwanese first as a separate category. And like you can see this in public opinion data over time. Yeah. So that's bad from Xi Jinping's perspective.
But to your point, if we get a situation and the scenario you outlined is interesting, if that's a deal Trump's worth cutting, I suppose it's possible the Taiwanese fight it out, but their options become a lot less attractive. I mean, we could talk about them trying to secretly develop a nuclear program as they have in the past, but that is also something that could lead to a major war. I just, since you mentioned it, looked it up. In February, Trump was asked whether he would defend Taiwan, and he wouldn't comment on it. All he said is, I don't ever want to put myself in that position.
That's reasonable and I think pretty clear cut too, right?
Yeah.
But that could also mean let's not get that far, right? And one
Yeah.
way to not get that far is I continue to sell arms to Taiwan and support them. Trump is all about selling weapons to other countries. He's very happy to do that. He just does not want to be embroiled in wars if he doesn't have to be, which I understand.
Well, so maybe we should build out this side of the equation. Like,
Yeah.
what are some of the costs? You know, the obvious benefit to shedding this commitment if you're the United States is it removes a potential flashpoint that could involve you in a great power war. But what are some of the costs of abandoning
Retreat.
the policy? Yeah.
Well, if you abandon that policy, I think the Japanese and South Koreans get pretty unhappy, probably the Filipinos too, because you are letting China get a lot stronger. And Taiwan is very close to Japan in particular. And that would make them very nervous and probably have them remilitarize at a much faster clip and maybe go for nuclear weapons too, would be my guess.
So, yeah, I mean, there's kind of there's ideological, moral considerations and then more purely strategic ones. One of them
Yeah.
is what you just said, which is if you're not going to make good on that commitment, other allies in the area start getting concerned. And as you said, maybe nuclearize. Another one, which I'll just shout out the research by Caitlin Talmadge and Brendan Green, who have done a lot of work on this, is the pure like military significance of Taiwan. You know, you'll hear it referred to as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, but
Right.
according to them and other scholars, its value goes a lot further beyond that because it allows the United States to defend. Taiwan's part of the first island chain. It allows the
Hmm.
United States to defend the second island chain much more effectively. If China retakes Taiwan, your position in the Philippines, as you said, becomes a lot
Tenuous.
trickier.
Yep.
Um, and then if we're just talking about credibility more broadly, which is something we talked a lot about in our episode on nuclear proliferation, it wouldn't necessarily just be in region effects
Hmm.
on allied behavior that could potentially spread elsewhere. And then obviously, as we already touched on, the semiconductor piece of it. So those are some of the arguments you see for maintaining the commitment.
Yeah. So counterpoints would be Trump already has demonstrated that he doesn't care about
True.
existing alliances that much. People's administration care somewhat more, but they don't matter from what I can tell.
Yeah.
They're a bunch of sock puppets, how I feel about it. And he demonstrably doesn't care that much about trade with China. I think he cares more about trade with East Asia more generally, because we're trying to cut deals now with the Koreans and the Japanese and the Filipinos, all of whom have been tariffed, the Indonesians too, right? On the other hand, he has not explicitly, but implicitly sort of ratified the idea of spheres of influence
Yeah.
and made it sound like, well, the Chinese are entitled as the biggest and strongest country in this area to run the place. And that's fine. We're going to run the Americas. He's much more interested in kicking the Chinese out of the Americas than he is in keeping them contained in East Asia.
And I mean, like, I don't know if this is the logic that people have framed this in for him, but most people, we talked in an early episode about the balance of resolve.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, I think in this case, believe that over the issue of Taiwan, the balance of resolve favors China.
100%.
That, Americans maybe can't even point it out on a map. And we might have, warm, fuzzy feelings about democracy there. But at the end of the day, that's not enough to, really
Start
put
a
things
nuclear
on the
war.
line. Yeah. And so, like, Taiwan is sometimes compared to being like the West Berlin of the 21st century. It's exposed, it's much closer to China than it is to the United States. They care about it seemingly a lot more than Americans do. And for a long time, you could kind of get away with that because the balance of capabilities was so skewed in favor of the United States. The fact that isn't the case now makes it a very difficult problem of defense for the United States. And so you have seen a number of analysts make this claim that it wouldn't be such a bad idea if you could cut some sort of deal, maybe as
Mm-hmm.
part of a grand bargain. And
Trade it
while,
away,
yeah,
basically.
that wouldn't be good if you're Taiwanese, but that if you're the United States, there's some real advantages to doing it potentially.
You might
Obviously,
have.
not everyone shares that view, but that's maybe sort of part of what he and his advisors are thinking.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And like any American administration would now need to start thinking about this more concretely. It's like you either need to really escalate and bring in a bunch of resources from all over the place to try to protect Taiwan and deter the Chinese. You also need to endow the Taiwanese with more lethal capabilities, um, because the Chinese are just getting stronger and more resolved. And that's probably going to continue to happen that way.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's why I think one of the reasons I think there's some appeal to that strategic hedgehog
yeah,
option is like, it sort of splits the difference. I mean, it's like allowing or trying to allow Taiwan to defend itself without putting, US involvement directly on the line.
can can the Taiwanese defend themselves plausibly without going nuclear?
My own view is no. I mean, I think they can raise the costs considerably, I think they can make it a very bloody engagement. But over the long term, no, I think China prevails if
Yeah,
the
I
United
do too.
States isn't involved.
They're just too big, too strong, too many people.
Even there, by the way, if you read some like reporting, I'm sure there is scholarly literature about it, but what I've seen more is from of the journalistic varieties. Like if you compare Taiwan to say Israel, it's only been in pretty recent years that Taiwan has started to take this issue much more seriously and
Yep.
try to step up military preparations. It hasn't been a warrior state, so to speak.
Haven't
And
been involved in 4 major
yeah,
wars and multiple sort of like grinding insurgencies or whatever you want to call the intifadas, right?
fair point. And
Yeah,
they're an island, which gives them a certain degree of insulation
it does until it doesn't,
until it
right? To
does.
your yeah, to your point, it's like this punctuated equilibrium where it's like they haven't needed to worry, and that's fine until they do need to worry, and then they're not prepared socially for like what's going to happen to them because it'll be really bad. How about this question? So, if the U.S. isn't willing to pay the costs, what about the Japanese?
Like, would Japan fight a war with China over Taiwan?
Yeah, maybe with our help, maybe not. And what would that look like?
That's a good question.
Yeah,
I don't have well formulated thoughts on that. My initial instinct is I'm a little skeptical that they might be willing to like resource the war or
well,
at least partly resource it. On the other hand, like if what you're getting at is if you're Japan
it's an
and you
existential threat.
yeah, and you see a retreating United States, which has kind of been the bedrock of your security policy. You know, we talk in security studies about what's known as preventive war, which is a war to you see a rising power that's eventually going to overtake you, or eventually you're going to be in a less advantageous position when it comes to the military balance. So you would rather have the war now than later. If you're Japan and you see a retreating United States and a China willing to assault Taiwan, maybe that sort of preventive war logic doesn't seem so bad. I think I would probably expect them to go nuclear before getting into a direct war with China.
Would that be enough to deter the Chinese from attacking Taiwan, the nuclearization of Japan? It might be, depending on what policy they put out, right? I agree. So Japan's a special case because they have the, pacifist constitution. They are actually starting to rearm
Yep.
slowly, but it's not clear what kind of appetite there is socially for full remilitarization, let alone nuclearization. But if the Chinese were to get Taiwan, that would be very bad for Japan, right?
Correct.
To your earlier point about they would then own the unsinkable aircraft carrier right next to Japan. They would be able to project power across the Japanese home islands and maybe start encircling Japan too.
Yeah, I mean, you could envision a situation where they try to turn some of these U.S. allies, Japan and South Korea, more or less into vassal states.
Yep.
And I think that would involve some challenges, but given the rate at which China's military and in particular its navy is developing, if you remove American power from the area, that's something that no Japanese leader can afford to ignore.
Totally.
Um, Now, what you said is an interesting thing. Would that be enough to deter a Japanese nuclear program? Be enough to deter China from going after Taiwan? My 2 cents is no. That Taiwan is considered such a central part of Chinese foreign policy and has been more or less since the end of the Chinese Civil War. I tend to think that would not be enough, but in East Asia, in which these countries that are hostile to China have nuclear weapons, is sort of a Chinese nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't totally want to rule it out, but I just think the way Beijing thinks about Taiwan is like that is ours, right? They refer to it as the renegade province.
There was a hope that China would liberalize. And, like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was some indication that might actually happen. There could be some kind of rapprochement between the two on increasingly democratic footing. That is definitely not happening.
And that whole school of thought, I think, has basically been discredited at this
It's
point.
been discredited, but it's like, what if there is change in China over time? Like, we could step back from the brink here. That's still a possibility. I do think that Japan remains a great power. Like, they don't necessarily think of themselves that way, and they don't have the military capability yet. They could acquire it, but it's going to come down to them choosing that path. If they don't choose that path to protect Taiwan, then I think they will be vassalized over time. So, like, I actually think that Japan is one of the keys to this whole equation. South
Yeah.
Korea is a little bit trickier, I would say.
But, this is part of the problem too, is like all of these US partners don't really get along,
True.
particularly with Japan for pretty good historical reasons.
Or even worse than the Nazis in a lot of ways.
I mean, China, Japan, that one goes back many, I mean, more than a century to,
well, thousands of years. Yeah.
okay, fair enough. But I was thinking I think it's the Treaty of Shimonoseki is like 1895, and then the Nanjing Massacre in 1937. And
that was a nasty one.
Yeah, you can read about it. I'm not going to talk about it right now because it is really unpleasant. But, then the Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula during the Second World War and things like comfort women, like the worst euphemism of all time. Taiwan was also under Japanese occupation, as was Indochina. Like, there's no love lost between these countries and Japan. And so every time the United States tries to do kind of security cooperation exercises, it's not easy to do because Japan is so unpopular with some of these other countries, in part because it's never apologized for any of these
Not
things.
really. They've kind of like obliquely, they've said that they regret occurrences. They have not taken responsibility, but it's like the Japanese might become a lot more popular.
Right.
If these countries are threatened directly by the Chinese.
Realism 101.
It's realism 101. Yeah, they start to balance, right? There's bandwagoning and there's balancing. Some countries might bandwagon. I don't know. It really depends on the particulars of Chinese policy and that country's policy at that time. But everybody is looking at Taiwan as like the keystone of
So
this
actually, can I ask you, I mean, I've seen different proposals floated, like the details vary, but essentially the idea that some people have, I think Charles Glazer had something to this effect about
my old advisor.
Oh, okay. Yeah. About a grand bargain. But like, basically the argument was you could do like retrenchment light. You could retrench on Taiwan and then use the basically assets you gain that are no longer needed to defend Taiwan to double down on your commitments to South Korea, to Japan, to the Philippines, to Australia. And that those are really where the red line is, and that would bring commitments in line with resources. I guess curious your reaction to that sort of proposal.
It's a good question. I wish I knew a little bit more about sort of the naval situation and how like the trade routes would work in that instance. I think it's a possibility, but you'd be giving up a lot.
Yeah.
To do that.
The military stuff, I think, is pretty clear what you'd be giving up. Again, the stuff by Talmadge and Green I mentioned is pretty good on that.
First to second island chain.
Yeah, but also, like, a lot of this has to do with, I mean, what China basically wants, and this gets back to your point about Trump, is to have a fairly significant sphere of influence in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And that's why it basically is claiming sovereignty over the East and South China Seas and building artificial islands out there. And that's why the United States has for years conducted these freedom of navigation patrols. I think you're right that however much you might try to reassure the other states in the area, hey, like, Taiwan is different, but we're still around for all of you. I'm not sure if
It's
that's
like
going to fly.
you're still around, but things have gotten worse,
Yeah.
like demonstrably worse. You're in a worse position militarily and economically. And so you need more troops, you need more planes, you need more ships, you need more nuclear weapons, right?
And right now, the trend is not favorable, right? The trend,
Yeah,
the balance for most people is continuing to shift in China's favor, at least at the theater level.
that's right. So I think you either stop it here or you don't stop it at all, is kind of what I think. And we risk a situation where from one administration to another, we have completely different policies, which is what's happened already.
Yeah, so I was going to say.
Yeah. So you get some incoherence in terms of planning. You get incoherence in terms of your messaging to the Chinese and all the other countries, including Taiwan. And that makes this even harder. So, two questions for you. Let's talk briefly about a Taiwanese nuclear program, because I think that's the one thing that could actually stop China in its tracks while also precipitating an immediate
That's right.
invasion, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, like, I have thought about this a lot and I always end up getting stuck. So, again, this is something we talked about in an earlier episode, but like, is it a perfect analogy? No, but I think it does some pretty good analytical work for us. Like, a Taiwanese nuclear program is sort of similar to how the Soviets thought about a West German nuclear program. Like,
Yeah.
it,
Unfavorable.
yeah, I mean, I maybe couldn't think of something more provocative, which is why when Taiwan, I'd have to review it, I think it was twice, seemed interested in acquiring a nuclear capability, and the United States found out, the United States brought massive pressure on Taiwan to give that program up.
Yep.
So, like, I've had students ask me, well, all right, if your concern is the safety of that program while the bomb is getting built, right? This is the window of vulnerability argument. Hey, China sees Taiwan building nuclear weapons. Surely it will take preventive military action against those facilities. Why not help them out? Now, aside from, there's this thing called the McMahon Act, which goes back to the 40s, that prevents the United States from sharing nuclear technology, even with allies. Now, there's been ways various administrations have sort of circumvented that.
I lost these documents.
But leaving that aside, like, China would hold the United States responsible for that.
Yeah, for sure they would. And would that result in immediate war between China and the US? Who knows? I don't know.
I don't know either. I mean, like, the advantage of doing that is Taiwan can defend itself. I don't know how China would lash out in that instance. Like, I think you and I maybe joked on an earlier episode, like, does China then say, hey, Venezuela,
right?
You want the bomb? I haven't heard anyone talk about that possibility. I'd be surprised if there hasn't been some discussion of that sort of thing among Chinese officials. I'd be surprised if no one's thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, like, to be clear, though, the Taiwanese don't need help. Technically, they would need fuel, right? If they were to acquire fuel somewhere, maybe this could go a lot faster.
And they would need cover during the period of, development of the program.
And part of the issue is that Taiwan is at least semi-penetrated by Chinese intelligence, we assume. By the way, the Taiwanese have intel on the mainland too. So it's a really interesting relationship between China and Taiwan. There's like family ties between the two. There are people on both sides that are trying to make something happen peacefully. There are people on both sides who are trying to do the opposite.
Yeah, I believe Taiwan is the territory that suffers more cyber attacks than any other on planet Earth because China is so active in cyberspace, which, by the way, if China were to blockade Taiwan, most people think the fiber optic cables, that would be one of the first things China did, would be to cut those and basically cut Taiwan off from the rest of the world.
Well, that's when you get Starlinks, right?
Yeah. Assuming Elon's in the mood.
You never know with that guy. Plus, the Chinese have developed a lot of anti-satellite warfare technology recently as a big part of this initiative. All right, let me bottom line. What do you think is going to happen here? And when do you think it's going to happen?
I guess as always, when I'm basically engaged in arguably irresponsible speculation, I'm going to say that's all it is. I suspect that there will come a time when the United States says that it's not in the protection of Taiwan business.
Coming during this presidential administration?
It's interesting because I think the odds are higher that it could happen under Trump.
Yep.
And as I think we said it on an earlier episode as well, she has said 2027 is the year by which he would like to reclaim the island.
Well, he has said he wants the capabilities.
The capability, that's right.
Yeah, not that he is aiming for that specific year.
Yes.
That China could do it if it,
which is now right around the corner.
2 years. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I would say like, yes, I consider it more likely to happen under Trump, but if it doesn't, I couldn't tell you when. You know, there's all sorts of unexpected things that could happen. China, until the recent self-inflicted wounds the United States has imposed on itself. Like most of the talk about the Chinese economy over the last few years was that it was not doing well because of their enormous housing bubble problems.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of things that could happen that could accelerate or decelerate this.
Ironically, all they need to do is sell those ghost cities to the United States and move them over here.
Yeah. Yes.
That would redress the imbalance.
But my sense with this has always been, I mean, since we mentioned Charles Glazer, he once told me this, you know, there's this concept in nuclear strategy of deterrence and compellence. Deterrence being don't do X or I will do Y. Compellence being do X or I will do Y.
Coercion.
And the latter is considered much more difficult because you are actively trying to change rather than preserve the status quo. And I remember he once told me, you know, in a situation where there's a war over Taiwan that's thus far has stayed at the conventional level between China and the United States, that China could credibly threaten to escalate to the nuclear level if it was losing such a war.
Yeah.
Because as you said, losing a war over Taiwan is probably the worst possible thing that could happen to the CCP.
Yep.
And so they would have sort of nothing to lose if they were to escalate.
Yeah.
That's to say, I think the balance of resolve firmly favors China. And I just think your average American is not going to be willing to risk a major showdown over the issue. So as this balance of capabilities continues to shift, my guess is we'll see something akin to this hedgehog strategy I've mentioned, where the U.S. arms Taiwan, but in the final analysis, either looks to cut a deal or soften that commitment in some shape or form. But predicting when that will happen, let alone if that will happen, is pretty tough to do. But what do you think?
I think I'm going to go one step further. I do think that Trump will bargain away Taiwan during this administration because he wants to, right? But there are good reasons to do it, which we've already discussed. It's a burning platform or a melting ice cube. Yeah. Things are not going to get better for the position of the United States. And yeah, there is actually an argument for getting what you can while you can.
What sorts of things do you think he'll try to extract as part of that deal?
I think he will try to extract an end to the unfair practices by the Chinese that, you know, they've legitimately or illegitimately been doing since their accession to the WTO.
Yeah.
Obviously, trade has come to a screeching halt between the U.S. and China. Maybe there's some way to, you know, get it going again if the Chinese allow their currency to appreciate. That's the big one.
The other thing,
currency controls.
I mean, that I think lends some credence to your prediction is like the traditional rules of like how domestic politics affect foreign policy seem not to apply to him.
Yeah.
Like, you know, in the past, if you imagine Barack Obama doing that kind of deal, not that was something that was under active consideration, but like, I think he would have been crucified, particularly by Republicans, but also by some Democrats for cutting Taiwan loose. I just don't think that's the sort of thing Trump is vulnerable to in the American political space for reasons I don't pretend to understand. But I think he has more flexibility to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think, certain senators would be really upset,
Sure.
but I don't think that matters as much as it used to, for
Yeah. And
sure.
I think he would then get in front of a microphone, and if they were Republicans, threaten their political future, and they would change their tune pretty quickly.
Totally. So, and once that happens, Taiwan goes one of two ways. I think they either make a dash for the bomb or they give up. Yeah, I don't think like a conventional hardening route will work or makes much sense. I could be wrong about that.
No, I mean, I tend to agree. And maybe if they do surrender, there's to use an awful phrase, I think from Henry Kissinger, maybe there's a decent interval before China does what it did in Hong Kong.
Right.
Sprinting for the bomb would be interesting based on the historical record. They probably wouldn't be able to pull it off.
It would be it would be too tough.
Not
Yeah.
because they don't have the technical know-how, because they wouldn't have the opportunity to defend their sites from Chinese military action.
Yeah, it just takes too long. And I mean, it could precipitate an invasion right away
Yeah.
before they're able to do it fast enough. Yeah. So all of this to say, I'm not bullish on Taiwanese independence long term, unfortunately. I'm not happy about this personally. Like, I don't think it's good, but I think it's kind of like how the world works. And how,
We believe in seeing the world as it is at Global Tantrum.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't have to like it, and I don't. But China is very big and very close, and the Taiwan Strait is not that thick,
Yeah.
So I just think it's going to be really tough. And the U.S., even under some other administration in the future, seems to be retrenching, and in many cases, that's not inappropriate. So
Yeah, I just to double check because I didn't want to get it wrong. But yeah, it's only about 100 miles off the coast, which
yeah, and
is roughly as far as Cuba is from Florida. And
that's right.
we all know what happens, how freaked out the US gets when things happen in Cuba.
Totally. Yeah. So to whatever that's analogous, I think again, the X factor is Japan and what Japan does. Because I do not necessarily think they'll just sit around and watch this happen. I don't know what they would do, right? Because I don't know enough about Japanese politics and security policy. But just thinking from a high level realist perspective, it would be super bad and much closer to an existential crisis for Japan than it would be for us.
Well, then I guess maybe one observable implication of your prediction would be if we start seeing Japan spend a lot more money on its military.
They're already doing it, actually. Like they're starting to ramp, and there's lots of reasons for that. I think North Korea is one of them,
Yeah.
but not the only one. There's also China and the Taiwan situation. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to a side effect could be the remilitarization of Japan in a real way.
Yeah, which again is not something China would want. So
Or
I
the
guess
Koreans or the Taiwanese for that matter. But
I guess I'm left where I typically am at the end of these episodes, which is the saying is, may you live in interesting times, but I feel it necessary to add just not too interesting.
yeah, exactly. Let's keep the tantrum contained, please, and not have
Yeah.
World War III. I would approve of that. Okay, this has been Stephen Galen for Global Tantrum. Till next time, everybody. Thank you.
See y'all.